The Hypnobirthing Toolkit is a complete hypnobirthing and birth preparation course helping you to go into the birth of your baby with confidence and positivity. It's completely self-paced with pre-recorded videos, presentations, audios, PDFs, plus monthly live classes. It's a more affordable and flexible way to learn hypnobirthing and help you have the positive birth experience you deserve. Follow the link in the description below to begin your positive birth journey today. Hello and welcome to the Bell Mama Hypnobirthing and Positive Birth podcast. My name is Ellie Waddington. I'm a hypnobirthing teacher, antenatal instructor and positive birth coach, and I'm here to help you go into the birth of your baby with a positive mindset. Every week I share my top tips, advice and amazing birth stories to help you go from fearful and anxious about your birth to positive and confident. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and let's get into this episode. Hey gorgeous mama, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. This week I am joined by the amazing Erin from Better Birth, who's going to be talking to us all about the massive topic of induction. Enjoy the episode. Hi Erin, thank you so much for joining us today. If you could just talk a little bit about who you are, where you are and what you do and that sort of thing, just introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Erin. I am a birth educator and a hypnobirthing instructor. I have been supporting families and couples with their birth prep since the pandemic. Launched my business right at the start of the pandemic. I'm just really passionate about making sure that families are well educated and prepared for navigating the maternity services in the UK and what to expect when they give birth.
Only since the pandemic then. I thought you'd been going a lot longer than that for some reason, but
No.
I think it's because you just sound like the way that you talk about things, you literally sound like you've been talking about birth your entire life. You're so knowledgeable. You sound like you've been talking about it for years. And for those of you who don't know, Erin also has an amazing podcast called the Better Birth Podcast, and I used to listen to that when I was pregnant with my second, preparing for my home birth, and it's a fantastic listen, so go over and have a listen to that as well. We're here today to talk about induction, which is a massive juicy topic to get stuck into, and I think I have the perfect guest in Erin to talk about that today. So first off, Erin, what is induction?
So induction, I think when people think about induction or they're offered induction, they tend to think of the pharmacological methods that people will be offered for various different reasons, and we'll talk about some of the common reasons for induction in a minute. But actually, induction of labour is anything that is inducing your labour before you spontaneously go into labour. So that might be a sweep, which is offered at 39 weeks. Or sometimes called a membrane sweep or a stretch and sweep. That's a non-pharmacological method, so there's no drugs involved with that. Or it might be more formal methods of induction in hospital. So whether that's synthetic prostaglandins, whether that is artificially rupturing your membranes or using synthetic oxytocin, just to name a few of the different methods. There are also natural methods, which people don't consider are induction, but they are induction, because again, you're trying to get your body to do something that it hasn't naturally started yet. So things like using clary sage or going and having some reflexology, for example, they are arguably lower risk versions of induction, but they're still forms of induction because we are trying to get the body to do something before you spontaneously go into labor.
Yeah, and I've always thought it's a bit of an oxymoron when people say natural methods of induction, because like induction isn't natural. Like you're trying to do something that your body isn't ready to do, because we know that when your body is ready to go into labor, it does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think, one of the issues I think with due dates, which is one of the reasons that people are offered inductions, because you have this deadline to have given birth by, is that people feel like if you go past that due date, that you're not going to go into labor, or it's really risky. And then we get offered inductions to try and force the body to go into labor before it actually is ready. And the way that labor that actually works, and when we think about pregnancy and birth, the baby will signal to the body, to the mother's body, when the baby is ready to be born. So when their lungs are fully developed, they are fully grown, they are ready to be born and live on the outside, they will produce hormones which will signal to the pregnant person's body that they're ready to be born, and that triggers labor. So induction is kind of artificially starting that process, arguably when the baby is not quite ready. And that can have an impact on the baby, and the baby's health. That can have an impact on the person giving birth as well, in terms of their experience of birth, as well as all of the processes and bonding and everything else that happens with the spontaneous labor. So while sometimes induction may be medically necessary or advisable, and there are a few reasons where potentially, yes, birthing baby earlier is advisable. I think it's really important that if somebody's being offered an induction, they understand what the evidence is and what are we trying to prevent with the induction versus what are the risks of the induction, because I think quite often we don't get the information to be able to weigh those two things. We just get given a load of information on how risky it is if we say pregnant, and we aren't given information on what the risks of the induction process are.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. As birth workers, we often get accused as a group of being really anti-induction or anti-intervention. And that's not what we are at all. We are very anti people going into things uninformed or without their eyes open. And if you're going to make a massive choice about something like induction, and I think sometimes it can be brushed off as kind of like the easy choice, you know, as like, oh, just have an induction to prevent this happening. But it does have massive implications, as you say, that women aren't always made aware of. And so I think that's what we're trying to achieve in an episode like this, is not trying to put you off of induction, but make you aware of everything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie and say that induction is an overwhelmingly positive experience for most people, because I mean, there are people that have very positive inductions, but a lot of people don't have the best experiences of induction. And that is because it does have an impact on labor and your experience of labor, because of the impact it has on your hormonal production, also your birth setting. Because if you're having an induction, then it's most likely that you're going to be in a very medicalized setting. It also, that setting and the induction process increases the chances of medical intervention and can trigger a cascade of medical intervention. And when we talk about cascade of medical intervention, basically what we're talking about is iatrogenic harm that is caused by the induction process. So quite often when we go for an induction, we are given a certain method of induction, and then further medical intervention is required to counteract the harm or the impact of that first method of induction. And then that kind of causes this domino effect where we end up with more and more medical intervention to counteract things that are less than ideal things that are happening in the birth process. So some people do have quite negative experiences of induction. I think one of the biggest issues, I think, with induction is the lack of information, because people are going into inductions without understanding what method of induction is going to be used, what the process is, how long you could be in hospital for, which I think is a huge issue. I go and speak every month I do ward rounds at my local hospital as part of my MVP work. And I always make a concerted effort to go to the induction ward to go and speak to anybody that's happy to be spoken to and get feedback from people on induction wards. And quite often people have been there for 2 or 3 days and they had no idea it was going to take that long, and they hadn't prepared to be in hospital for that long. So I think having realistic expectations around the induction process, having complete clarity on what the different steps are, what your options are, what your rights are, and being completely on board with the idea that induction is necessary is going to go a long way to helping you have a more positive experience than going in completely blind, not really understanding why you're having the induction, but you've been told you're going to have a dead baby if you don't, so you go along, and then it ends up being very traumatic because you have no control over the situation and things cascade.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And the difference in certainly the ladies that I've supported, the difference between a positive and a negative induction is the ones that had a positive induction, they were prepared for it. They went in knowing exactly what they were getting, why it was happening, and they were able to put in place extra measures to help themselves cope with that. And the ones that had a negative experience, they had only prepared for a spontaneous birth. They didn't know that induction was a different way of giving birth, and they hadn't prepared properly for that, because they are different. Spontaneous labor and induced labor, they're different, aren't they?
Yeah. So a spontaneous labor, our bodies are very clever, right? When we go into labor, there are certain things that happen which causes a domino effect in our bodies. So the baby signals to the body the baby's ready to be born. That triggers certain hormonal releases, like our oxytocin, which triggers contractions. The higher our oxytocin levels get, the more pain relief hormone, endorphins we get. And that helps us cope with the labor, helps us progress the labor. Then the baby's born, and then we continue to produce these hormones to help birth the placenta, which reduces the chances of hemorrhaging. The umbilical cord is designed so it's long enough so the baby can be put straight onto the chest and onto the nipple. That boosts the oxytocin to help birth the placenta. So all these things, they kind of generally work together, and things work in a certain way for a reason. And when we intervene with birth, like for example with induction, that disrupts that domino effect of ideal hormonal balance and process and procedure that happens during birth. So when we have an induction, we are forcing the body to do something that it wasn't quite ready to do. The baby's not quite ready for it either. The contractions that can be induced with induction can be very, very intense. And the drugs that we are given during an induction, if you're having a pharmacological method of induction, can disrupt your natural oxytocin, which in turn disrupts your endorphins, which means you have very intense contractions and you don't have high levels of pain relief hormone to help you cope with those contractions. So then you're more likely to ask for pain relief, so opiates or epidural. If you're having an epidural, for example, then you're more likely to be on your back. You've probably got CTG monitoring on at this point because you're having a medical induction. So you've lost your mobility as well. Because you can't feel your contractions, you're more likely to be coached to push. And we know that can have an issue of making the second stage of labor longer. A longer labor can cause distress in baby, as well as those contractions being very intense and not giving baby chance to cope with those contractions, which can cause fetal distress. And then we end up with an episiotomy or forceps or an unplanned C-section. So an induced labor is different. It feels different, and the process is different from a spontaneous labor. And from speaking from experience, this is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this topic, because I had an induction with my first child, and you know, I was overdue. I'm doing like air quotes here because, you know, who knows if we were actually overdue. But I was overdue. It was 41 weeks, and my daughter was classed as small for gestational age. And actually, they didn't tell me either of those things at my appointment. They just said that it's really quiet at the minute and we have beds. So I was like, okay, because I thought, well, that's why you go in for an induction, right? It's quiet, and you know that got to that point. And it was awful. It was awful because no one had explained the induction process to me whatsoever. I didn't know what to expect. I hadn't done hypnobirthing or any kind of birth prep, so I had no coping methods whatsoever. I went straight for the drugs because it was painful. I'm not going to lie, it was painful. And that had an impact on the rest of my labor. It impacted my post-birth experience as well, because my daughter was completely out of it from all the opiates and the epidural. And I was exhausted after a really long labor. Never managed to get her to breastfeed, so I never breastfed her. And she ended up with very severe silent reflux, and she also has allergies. And my whole first 2 years probably of her life was just really traumatic, and I really do put a lot of that that was kind of triggered by the way I gave birth and the drugs that were used during that birth. And then I compare that to my second and third babies, who, you know, were spontaneous. I had no drugs. I didn't even use gas and air, not because I was kind of anti using it, but I didn't need it because it was very manageable. And sometimes, you know, like I said, sometimes these medical interventions are necessary and they are life-saving. I want to make it really clear that I'm not saying that medical intervention is the devil. It's not. Like, there is a time and a place for that. What what I really want to get across is that people need to understand, is the induction that's being offered to you medically necessary? Has someone told you you've got a threefold increase in stillbirth? And have they quantified what that risk is? Because quite often we have these conversations with care providers about the necessity of not going overdue and the risk of stillbirth because you have XYZ complications or high risk indications, and these risks are not quantified. And actually quite a lot of the common reasons for induction, the actual quantifiable risk is so statistically low that if somebody knew that and they knew those figures, they probably wouldn't be going ahead with the induction on balance. So I think having the information is so important, and having realistic expectations of what to expect.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the majority of inductions happen not because there's a medical emergency, but because there's a small risk of something happening, and I think it becomes so skewed in our minds because the induction rate now in the UK is about 40%, am I right? And in some individual trusts, it's even higher than that. And so we think, wow, there's lots of medical emergencies happening, but that's not true. It's to try and prevent something that may or may not happen, and actually is really, really likely not to happen.
Yeah, and if it's an argument that I get quite a lot, because obviously I talk a lot about induction, and I have an induction quick guide which I sell in my online shop. So it is something that I talk about quite a lot, and quite often, depending on the social media platform, because I've realized that different platforms have different kinds of people. But quite often, so for example, on TikTok, I get naysayers who will say, but induction's really necessary, and why would you want to risk it a baby, and the induction rates have increased because they're trying to prevent stillbirth. But actually, if you look at the rate of stillbirths in the UK over the past 10 years, last year our stillbirth rate was the same as 5 years ago, but our induction rate has gone through the roof. So the increase in inductions is not equating to a reduction in the stillbirth rate. It is not having the impact which people think it's having. What it has potentially had an impact in is the number of birth injuries, the number of postpartum hemorrhages, the number of C-sections, and the number of serious tears. All of those things have increased over the past significantly over the past 5 years, have really increased. It's quite hard to get the data, and I've spent all week this week actually compiling data because I wanted to do a graph to look at all of this stuff. And birth injuries is something that's very hard to get information for, but I could find information on birth injury claims against the NHS. And the rate of birth injury claims for cerebral palsy and brain damage in babies has gone up ridiculously high over the past 5 years, along with the induction rate. Obviously, we don't know for definite that one affects the other, but I'm going to put myself out there and say that actually, yes, I do think it is the rate of medical intervention that is increasing, that is causing these poorer outcomes. So it's not just about preventing stillbirths. Yes, obviously we want to prevent them, but we also have to factor in the impact that medical intervention like induction is having on the babies long term and on the parents long term, because it's not just about everyone being alive at the end of it. If you have PTSD, you have postnatal depression, you have life-changing pelvic floor damage, that affects not just you, but your baby and the rest of your family as well. So we need to be looking at the bigger picture, and then deciding, do we think this is necessary or not? Is the risk that great, the thing that we're trying to prevent, or is the risk of all these other things happening with going ahead with the procedure more likely?
Yeah, and that math just doesn't math at all, does it? Like, if you have an increase in this major intervention, you'd expect that because of all the side effects and the long-term consequences that come with it, you would expect the major consequences such as stillbirth to be coming down, and the fact that they're not, and we can see that as people sat here on our computer screen. Why can people not see that are further up, that are making policies? Why are they not able to see that?
I mean, I think a lot of this is defensive practice. So ultimately, a lot of the guidelines and the policies in the NHS are designed to look at the worst outcomes and preventing those worst outcomes. And I think when it comes to things like pelvic floor damage from serious tears or instrumental births, looking at mental health problems, one of the biggest causes of death postnatally in the first 12 months after giving birth is suicide in women and people giving birth. But I feel there's a real disconnect with the people who are responsible for the births and the maternity care and pregnancy and birth and what happens afterwards, because it's almost like you get handed off from the midwifery team and then you're in the community and you have to see your GP, and the two things are just not marrying up. And we know, again, things like mental health is deprioritized by the government. It's not, you could be waiting months and months and months before you actually even see anybody. There is a real postcode lottery when it comes to pelvic floor health and whether you get support afterwards or not. Some hospitals have amazing teams and you will automatically get appointments if you've had a third or fourth degree tear. Other trusts, there's nothing. You don't see anybody. You have to proactively go and see your GP. So I think a lot of the issue is the disconnect between different departments of the NHS not connecting the dots. And I think part of it is trying to prevent the outcomes which seem the worst, like stillbirth, and the ones that are most likely going to be causing litigation against the NHS, unfortunately.
Yeah. Wow, that's a real sad state of affairs, isn't it? That's a real sad thing to hear. So out of interest, what is the statistic for stillbirth going past your due date? Because that is the most common reason for induction, as far as I'm aware, isn't it? What is that figure at the moment?
So going past your due date, again, this is something that's trotted out all the time with induction. You can't go past 41 weeks, so you can't go past 42 weeks because the risk of stillbirth is so high. And it depends on what you look at. So if we look at the 2018 Cochrane review, they found that the risk of stillbirth does increase with the length of pregnancy. However, we need to induce 426 women between 41 and 42 weeks to prevent one stillbirth. So that's a lot of arguably unnecessary inductions. Another study that I found had looked at 15 million pregnancies, and they found that the risk of stillbirth at 37 weeks was 0.11 per thousand. And then at 42 weeks, that's 3.18 per thousand. So that's quite a significant increase from 0.11 to 3.18. I don't know why research studies always do this per thousand measure, because I personally find that quite abstract to understand. If you convert that to a percentage, that's a 0.01% risk at 37 weeks of stillbirth versus a 0.3% risk of stillbirth at 42 weeks. So that's a 99.7% chance of not having a stillbirth at 42 weeks.
Yeah, so you're right in that when you say, like, what was it, 3 per thousand, that sounds like quite a high amount. But then when you convert that into a percentage, actually that's not that high at all, as far as I'm concerned. So someone else may disagree. Someone else may think, oh, that's quite a high risk for me, so I'll accept the induction. But someone else may not consider that a high risk. And so it is so important that you do find out these facts and figures yourself. Don't just accept someone saying, oh, the risk doubles, blah, 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 because that doesn't mean anything. As we've just proven, that saying it doubles doesn't mean anything if you don't know what those facts and figures are to begin with.
And this is you make a good point, because this is what's so important, is having those figures. Because you're right, some people will hear a 3 in 1,000 chance and say, but that's still too high for me, and that's fine, but we need the information in order to make informed decisions. And if you're given a threefold increase, or the risk is doubled from what? Doubled from 1% to 2%, or from 20% to 40%? Because that's a huge difference, right? Now, if we look at census data from the UK, in 2020, and there have been embrace reports published since 2020. However, I refer to 2020 data because it's the last embrace report that actually reports on births and stillbirths past 42 weeks, because the latest embrace report that was published last year in 2023 didn't give any information on post 42 weeks births, because they said the numbers were too small to be statistically significant, which is frustrating. But if we look at 2020, between babies born between 37 weeks and 41 plus 6, there was 1.23 stillbirths per thousand births. And after 42 weeks, there was 1.06 per thousand. So actually, if you think about percentages, there were fewer stillbirths after 42 weeks compared to before that. Now, there's obviously the number of people going past 42 weeks, the number of babies being born between 37 and 41 plus 6, and then after 42 is hugely different. Okay, there's far more babies being born in that earlier period than after 42 weeks. But I think the fact that you have a 0.106% chance of a stillbirth after 42 weeks, according to actual data from the UK in 2020, should be slightly comforting. Now, obviously, the people that are choosing to go past 42 weeks are probably low risk, so they're less likely potentially to experience a stillbirth, and they're probably getting monitored more closely, because that's what most people will agree to have more close monitoring. But I still think, again, if we're being told that it's really risky to go past 42 weeks, that again, you're given the actual statistics on what is that risk. Plus, how do you even know that you're 42 weeks? Like, what does that mean? Because the way we calculate due dates is archaic. Even when we refine it with scans can be 15 to 20% out, which is a huge margin of error. And there's an assumption that every baby is ready to be born at 40 weeks. They're not. You know, the fact that 81% of babies are born after 40 weeks, to me, implies that the 40-week mark is wrong, because the majority of babies are not ready to be born by 40 weeks. So going past 40 or going even past 42, a lot of people think that 42-week mark is like a hard and fast deadline, and you really, really can't go past that point. I'm not saying you should, but I have had clients who have gone past 42 weeks. One of my clients had a home birth at 44 weeks. Was she actually 44 weeks? Got no idea, because do we know? But I think, again, you need to understand how due dates are calculated and the inaccuracy of those before we start considering medical intervention. There's so many different factors to consider. And I think just so many people are being told you need an induction because your placenta's going to fail, or your baby's going to get too big, or one of my clients was told by her consultant, well, we should induce you at 41 weeks because there's no benefit of keeping the baby in there any longer, and if you don't give birth by 42 weeks, then you're not going to go into labor, which is absurd.
That's nuts. I mean, I think they must expect us as women to just sit there and go, okay. They don't think that you're then going to go away and, ask other people about it, or, do your own research. But to say that's nuts, that's crazy. Like, no one has stayed pregnant forever. Like, you don't like stay there with like a 27-year-old child inside your belly, do you? You will eventually go into labor.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think there are some real red flags when we think about some of these induction discussions, but ultimately I would be asking for the evidence. And if they can't give you the evidence, then ask them to get it and send it to you later. Because why are they making recommendations if they don't know the evidence behind the recommendation?
Yeah, and something that I always tell my clients is that you should never, ever feel pressured into making a decision then and there in that office. If you're being offered an induction, you've got time to think about it. Go away, do your own research, talk it through your birth partner, and then phone back. And, you have time to do that. If there was a genuine medical emergency where you and your baby are in danger, they'd be offering you a C-section, not an induction, which can take days, if not a week, to get booked in and then work.
Well, absolutely. And if you get told, but if we don't book you in now, then we might not be able to fit you in later. Well, then it's not that urgent then, is it, if you can't fit me in?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Doesn't make sense.
any sense whatsoever.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely crazy. So we've talked quite a lot about due dates, which is kind of the most common reason that you're most likely to be offered an induction in the UK. What are some of the other reasons that you might be offered induction?
There's a very long list. There's a very
There
long
is. You could be
and
offered an
and
induction for all sorts of reasons.
this is not an exhaustive list. Basically, it is virtually impossible to not be offered an induction unless you give birth by 38 weeks. You are going to be offered some form of induction. Um, and some of the reasons are, you know, I would say medically necessary. However, the vast majority of them aren't medically necessary, or they are not backed by evidence or research. So common ones are saying that your baby is really big. So if they say you've got a big baby, they're probably going to offer you an induction. Big babies, the concern there is that your baby's going to get too big and they're going to get stuck. And you'll have labor dystocia, and then potentially you will have shoulder dystocia because your baby's so big, and baby's shoulder's going to get stuck in your pelvis, and then they could have brachial plexus palsy where they have nerve damage in that area. However, half of babies with shoulder dystocia are small, so it's not something that's unique to big babies, and it would take 3,700 C-sections to prevent one permanent case of brachial plexus palsy. So even if your baby does have brachial plexus palsy, in the vast majority of cases, it's not permanent and they're fine. So you see how we kind of like, this is the risk, and then, but actually if it happens, then, you know, the risk of permanent damage gets smaller, and you know, so again, we need to be quantifying what those risks are. And actually a lot of people who are induced for big babies have a baby and then the baby's not big because the scan was wrong and the way we measured the baby was wrong. And some people just have big babies. If you are 6 foot and your partner is 6 foot, you are going to have a big baby, and there is nothing wrong with that. It's genetics. And the same goes with the other most common method, or very common reason, for induction, which is small babies, which is why I was induced from my first. Small babies. Some babies are just small. I'm Asian. I'm Chinese. I'm 5'1". My husband's not that tall, and he's also Chinese. I'm never going to have big babies. And there was nothing wrong with any 3 of my children. They were just small because it's genetics. And the problem with inducing for a small baby is they are more likely to struggle with the induction process because they're smaller. They've got less fat reserves and energy stores. You're more likely to end up with an unplanned C-section with a small baby. And some babies are just small, and there's nothing wrong with them. I think with big babies and small babies, one thing that I always say to my clients is what's their growth charts look like. Consistency of growth is really important. If your baby's on the 90th centile, and they've always been on the 90th centile, that's just how big they're supposed to be. Same if they're like, you know, 10th centile. What potentially is a cause for concern is if you've had a baby on the 25th centile, for example, and then each time you've been measured, they're going up the charts or they're going down the chart, and there's not consistency of growth, because that can maybe signal undiagnosed gestational diabetes if they're getting bigger, or maybe intrauterine growth restriction, or an issue with the placental the blood flow from the placenta to the baby if the baby's growth is stalling, for example. That would be a cause for concern. But if your baby's growing fine, and you're small and you have a small baby, then you might want to dig into the reasons a little bit more about whether that induction is necessary. Other common reasons are gestational diabetes. The problem with gestational diabetes is the goalposts for being diagnosed with gestational diabetes in pregnancy are, you know, quite narrow. And if you weren't pregnant and you kind of fell within the kind of outer boundaries of that, you probably wouldn't be diagnosed as being diabetic. So they move the goalposts closer together when you're pregnant to diagnose diabetes. And if your gestational diabetes is really well managed, say for example you're diet managed, and your baby's growth is not an issue, and you're not having a huge baby, then why are we inducing? Because I would argue that you're not higher risk than somebody that doesn't have gestational diabetes because it's well managed. being classed as a geriatric mother.
Oh yeah, God.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually had an interview, a podcast interview with someone last week who she supports quotes geriatric mums. Yeah, and that's an awful term.
It's
Awful term.
horrible. I mean,
Yeah.
I was classed as geriatric. Once you're past 35 years old, you are classed as advanced maternal age, and therefore higher risk. But again, I think it's really important to quantify what that risk is, because a lot of the research around risk for advanced maternal age comes from the 1940s. And the actual risk, the actual quantifiable risk, again, is quite small. Perhaps we should be taking into account, the maternal health instead. So, how much exercise do you do? What's your blood pressure like? How healthy do you eat? Those things are probably, I'd say, more important than just your age alone. If you are not white, you might get offered an induction. Year before last, NICE guidelines wanted to add something into the induction guidelines around inducing Black and Asian and mixed women and birthing people, which obviously kicked up a huge uproar because it's massively racist. And the reason why it's so racist is because people who are not white have higher risk of poorer outcomes, but it's not due to genetics, it's due to racism in the NHS. You are treated differently. And people will say, oh, but what about, people who are Black are more likely to come from less wealthy areas. They are more likely to come from areas of social deprivation. Well, if we actually look at the Embrace report that looked at that, and you look at the rates of maternal death in Black women, it doesn't matter whether they are from an area of low social deprivation or they are from very affluent areas. They are still more likely to experience death than white women. So it doesn't matter how well educated, how wealthy you are. If you are not white, you are more likely to experience stillbirth or maternal death during labor, and that is because you get treated differently. So the fact that we are inducing people because they are not white, that's inherently racist. That's not a medical reason for induction. High BMI is also another one. So if your BMI is over 30 or 35, depending on the trust, then you will get told that you are higher risk. I had an Olympic weightlifter as a client who was obviously peak fitness, and they were classed as a high BMI and high risk. But BMI, the weight body mass index, was not designed to be a measure of health. It was a way of measuring the ideal man. Of course, it was designed to measure the ideal.
I'm halfway through Sarah Wickham's new book, The Plus Size Pregnancy, and that's how she starts off, saying it was based on about 200 white middle-aged men.
Yeah.
And it's not designed to measure anything, basically. It's nonsense.
It doesn't take into account your gender. It doesn't take into account your bone density, your muscle mass, or the amount of your level of fitness, all of which are really important. And you might get told that you need an induction because your BMI is high. I would argue that's BMI alone is not a good indication of whether you need an induction or not. If you have signs of preeclampsia, which can be very serious. So if you have protein in your urine, you have high blood pressure, you might have swelling in your hands and feet, for example. Those can be signs of preeclampsia. And the only way to resolve preeclampsia is to birth baby. And if you have genuine preeclampsia, it can be very dangerous to you and baby. So that would be a medical reason for an induction. However, some people just have high blood pressure at their antenatal appointments because they're stressed. That is not preeclampsia. So I would be asking for a blood pressure cuff to take home and to take your blood pressure at home in between appointments. Because if it's only high when you're in hospital and it's fine when you're at home, then you probably don't have preeclampsia. Other things like reduced fetal movements, that may be a genuine reason for getting baby out earlier. I'm intentionally saying getting baby out earlier because it's not just induction is not the only option here. C-section is also an option. if we genuinely feel like baby, is better out than in. Um,
And I think it's worth noting that you are allowed to request that as well. You're perfectly within your rights to request a C-section rather than induction.
Yeah, which is, I think, is also probably a reason why our C-section rates are so high and have been escalating. It's not just emergency C-sections that are happening as a result of induction. It's also elective C-sections because people are being told they need an induction and they don't want one, and so they're electing for a C-section instead. So although induction is not causing the elective C-section rate, it's having an impact, I think. What else? Infection may be a genuine reason if there is an infection. IVF is a really common one, which I would argue, depending on how you feel and what the circumstances are, it isn't a medical reason. IVF With an IVF pregnancy, you have a higher risk of stillbirth up to 28 weeks. After 28 weeks, the risk of stillbirth is not elevated compared to other pregnancies. So I would argue that actually maybe it's not a medical reason. However, I think there's probably an opinion that if you've tried very hard to get pregnant, you want to avoid at all costs any poor outcomes. But again, I think if you've got an IVF pregnancy, which you've gone through a lot to get pregnant, then you need to consider the impact the induction may have on your birth process and how that's going to impact you postnatally as well with your mental health and your bonding. So I think, again, it's a bigger picture there to consider. Prolonged rupture of membranes. So if your waters go and your contractions don't start, they will want to induce you immediately. However, 45% of people will go into labor within 12 hours, and around 95% of people will go into labor within 24 hours of their waters breaking. But the guidelines are to induce immediately or within 24 hours. So we're just robbing 95% of people a spontaneous birth, unmedicated birth, by inducing immediately.
Yeah, that's bizarre. That there is, like, when you actually spell these things out, like I'm just kind of here with one of my eyebrows raised, thinking like, what? Like, what? That makes no sense.
It doesn't, does it? The thing is, once your waters go, there's a risk of infection. Yes, there is a risk of infection because baby's no longer in a sterile environment because the amniotic sac is not providing a barrier. But how do you think they check to see if your waters are broken? They're going to give you a vaginal exam, or they're going to give you a speculum exam, which is potentially pushing bacteria up your vagina and then into your uterus and causing infection. So if your waters are gone, nothing goes up there, because that's going to increase the risk of infection. And actually, the research shows that the risk of infection with prolonged rupture of membranes really starts to climb after 48 to 72 hours. So again, we've got guidelines which are overly risk adverse compared to actually what the research is saying.
Yeah, that's absolutely nuts. That's crazy.
And then, quite often people will be told that if you go past a certain point, your placenta is going to stop working.
Is that true? Like, I've heard that a lot. Is that true?
No, anyone that gets told that, I would really urge them to go and look at Dr. Rachel Reed's blog. Her website's midwifethinking.com. Go and search for placenta on a website, and she's got a really good blog post on placentas failing, because no, I mean, if you ask for the research behind it, they're going to struggle to give you the research. And actually, a certain level of calcification of the placenta is normal as pregnancy progresses. Your placenta is not a ticking time bomb. It's not going to suddenly just pack up at a certain point. If there's signs at scans or baby's growth are indicating that there's an issue of the placenta, then yes, okay, maybe then that's appropriate to consider getting baby out sooner. But if everything is fine, then I would be arguing questioning why what's indicating that my placenta is going to just pack up all of a sudden once I hit past 40 weeks. And then there's reasons like, for example, because it's Christmas, or it's
we've seen those charts, haven't we, with the inductions either side of Christmas. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and people say that that's not true. Well, like the figures in the UK speak for themselves. Um, I mean, yeah, of course, some people may not be going into hospital proactively on Christmas Day and trying to hold out as long as possible, and that's probably got an impact as well. But I would also say that inductions, um, they probably don't happen as much on Christmas Day, Boxing Day, Christmas Eve. Um, so I mean that's just some of the reasons. I mean, every time I teach my classes and I ask my clients, what reasons can you think of for induction? They always come up with something that I haven't got on my list. But it's like I said, it's really hard not to be offered an induction. And as you can see from like the reasons that I've just given, a lot of them are not evidence-based.
Yeah, so you just gave a list of what, like 15 or so reasons, and there are probably two there that would actually be considered medical emergencies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's crazy. We're not crazy, folks. Like this is actually happening. Like this is actually happening. Um, so we've talked now about reasons for being offered induction, of which there are many. What now? Could you talk about methods of induction? What could be the process?
So there's different methods of induction. Obviously, I mentioned the sweep earlier, which can be performed anywhere. Could be done at home if you're having a midwife come to your house, or it can be done in clinic. Um, I want to be really clear with all of these methods of induction. They might have benefits, but they also have risks. Okay, and again, I've heard quite often people get told with a sweep that there's no risk of a sweep. That's not true. Just this month in my group course that I was teaching, one of my clients in her previous pregnancy had a sweep and it triggered a cascade of medical intervention. And now that we've talked through it, she was like, God, well, I can see very clearly that's what caused it. And she had no idea because nobody talked her through the risks of a sweep. A sweep, they're quite often offered as this innocuous thing, which you are just given at 39 weeks, 40 weeks, because that's what you do because you're approaching or you've gone over your due date. But they do have risks. The fact that somebody is sticking a finger up your vagina and through your cervix could be pushing bacteria into your uterus. That is a risk. The fact that somebody's digging around your cervix and may very likely cause bleeding is a risk, because if when you go into labor there's bleeding and they're not sure where that bleeding is coming from, then you might lose your birth center birth because they're like, you're bleeding, we're not sure where the blood's coming from. I think it's better if you're on labor ward. So that's definitely a risk. The fact that it's really uncomfortable is a risk, because your cervix has nerve endings, it's sore. And also the fact that there is a risk that they could accidentally or on purpose rupture your membranes doing a sweep. And then they're going to want to intervene with further methods of induction because of the risk of infection that they just caused.
Yeah, and you're right in this. It's often very breezily talked about. They're like, right, let's get you up on the bed for a sweep, and there's no mention of the fact that it is optional. It's all optional, and as you say, it comes with risks.
Yeah. And again, because it's a method of induction, we're forcing the body to do something that it wasn't ready to do, which means that you can end up with a longer labor. And a longer labor means that you're more exhausted, also means the baby's more exhausted, and that can increase the risk of medical intervention as well. So, and I'm not saying that every sweep results in a cascade, but there is risk, so I think you need to know those risks before you agree to a sweep.
And it's not actually that likely to work either.
No.
Am I right in thinking it's about 1 in 8 that are successful, something like that?
Well, I would query even that statistic, to be honest, because the fact to do a sweep, you have to be a centimetre dilated already, because the midwife can't get her finger through the cervix to do the sweep unless you're already dilated. So if you do go into labour and you were already beginning to dilate, what would you have gone into labour anyway without the sweep? I mean, it might have pushed you a day or two closer, more or less, who knows? But there's no way to know, really. So I would argue a sweep at 42 weeks is more likely to work than a sweep at 39. I've heard people having multiple sweeps, like having 4, 5, 6 sweeps. I would say if you've had 2 or 3 and it's not working, your body's not ready and your baby's not ready. And again, the more sweeps you have, the higher the risk of infection as well. And then we have more like pharmacological methods or mechanical methods of induction, which are usually done in hospital on the induction ward. So we have things like synthetic prostaglandins, which are synthetic forms of hormone which are inserted in the vagina as close to the cervix as possible to try and get the cervix to efface and dilate. Not suitable for somebody who's had a previous C-section because of the risk of scar rupture, because synthetic prostaglandins can overstimulate the uterus, and that can cause the scar to rupture with if you've got a previous C-section scar. It can also cause uterine rupture in somebody who hasn't had a previous C-section. And again, it's a small risk, but there is a risk of uterine rupture, which is obviously an obstetric emergency and could lead to a hysterectomy. Again, doesn't happen very often, but I can guarantee you that's very rarely mentioned at all if you're going in for an induction. So then we have balloon catheter, which is a mechanical method of induction. So that's a rubber catheter which is inserted up the vagina through the cervix, and then the balloon is inflated with sterile water. And that applies pressure to the top of the cervix to stimulate oxytocin, and try and get you to start dilating and contracting. A benefit of that is there's no drugs involved with using a balloon catheter because it is a mechanical method. So it's got a lower risk of hyperstimulation and it's suitable for VBACs. However, there's a risk of infection because we're pushing something through the cervix. It is still forcing the body to do something that it wasn't ready to do. So there is still, again, a risk of a longer labour and a medical cascade. Dilapan rods, which are a method of induction which is not that common. They've been around for about a decade. My local hospital introduced them last year. So the NHS is a bit slow on the uptake of some of these methods. And they're like little rods of a hydrogel. So they are, it sounds really awful. They are an osmotic dilator. So they basically absorb the cervical fluid in your cervix and the gel swells and manually dilates your cervix. So they insert 3 to 5 of those little rods through your cervix. And then over a period of 24 hours, they will manually dilate your cervix. Again, no drugs involved, which is a benefit. Suitable for VBACs. All 3 of these methods potentially are suitable for outpatient induction. And that would be where you have these methods inserted and then you go home, which actually has better outcomes than staying in hospital. However, with dilapan rods, again, we have risk of infection. And interestingly, if you go and look at the dilapan website and you look at the little leaflet insert that comes with the dilapan rods, they actually recommend prophylactic administration of antibiotics with the use of dilapan rods, which they wouldn't be recommending if there was no risk of infection.
Yeah.
So, and again, we're trying to get the body to do something, so you could end up with a longer labour. With the one risk which I didn't mention with the balloon catheter is cord prolapse.
Okay.
Which is quite serious. So if the baby's head is sitting in the pelvis and the umbilical cord is running underneath the baby's head and our waters break, which can happen with the balloon catheter, then the umbilical cord may slip out first, and that's an obstetric emergency. You need to go straight into theatre for a C-section because the cord can become compressed, and that can affect the baby. So those 3 methods are quite common first methods of induction. However, the most common is synthetic prostaglandins, and that's because you don't need to be slightly dilated in order to have that method. If you wanted a balloon catheter or dilapan rods, you need to be slightly dilated because otherwise they can't get that method through the cervix. So most people will end up with synthetic prostaglandins. Then the next stage is to break your waters if they haven't broken already. So artificial rupture of membranes. And that's using something which basically looks like a crochet hook. I mean, I can't describe it as anything else, which they push through the cervix and the hook snags the bag of waters and releases your amniotic fluid. And then your baby's head presses on the cervix, which ramps up labour. Obviously, again, there's a risk of infection because we are pushing something through the cervix and then we're breaking the bag of water so babies no longer in a sterile environment. And one of the other risks is once you break the bag of waters, then your baby's potentially stuck more in a certain position because it hinders their rotation. If you think about baby being in a balloon of water, that water is going to facilitate movement of the baby. And once the waters have gone, then baby can't move as easily. So if they're in a suboptimal position, they're more likely to be stuck in that suboptimal position, which can have an impact later on in labour. And then if it's deemed necessary because you're not progressing fast enough or those methods of induction not working, then you might have synthetic oxytocin, which lots of people have heard of, and usually in quite a negative light. And that's because it can be quite uncomfortable having the synthetic oxytocin. So that will induce contractions, but synthetic oxytocin is not the same as natural oxytocin. So when our brains produce high levels of natural oxytocin, like I said earlier, it triggers the release of endorphin so that our body and our brain can cope with the intensity of the contractions that are being induced by the natural oxytocin. When we have synthetic oxytocin administered, which is usually given via a cannula in the back of the hand, then you have very intense contractions quite quickly, and they can come quite hard and quite fast. And it doesn't trigger the release of endorphins, so you don't have the high pain relief hormones going through your bloodstream to help you cope. So with synthetic oxytocin, it's quite common to ask for pain relief like opiates or epidural. And like I said earlier, that can cause a cascade of further medical intervention, particularly like, for example, with epidural, being on your back, being guided to push, not feeling your contractions and so on. So those are the common kind of stages and methods of induction. And you can ask for one over the other, which I think is important. And again, it's about information, isn't it? Because if nobody tells you that these are the three different methods of induction you can have, here's the pros, here's the cons, then you wouldn't know to ask, for example, for dilapan rods. Most people will just have the pessary. So I think it's really important to ask questions about, well, what methods of induction are you going to suggest? Is that right for me? Am I happy with that method of induction, or do I want an alternative? Or does your hospital even offer that method? Because you might prefer a certain method of induction over another. For example, for example, if you're aiming for a VBAC, then synthetic prostaglandins wouldn't be advisable for you.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that you can change your mind as well. Like, there are obviously some things which you can't undo, for example, like breaking your waters. But at any point you can say, actually, no, I don't want this. Or you can take the drip out of your hand, anything, and you can change your mind.
Yeah, and if at any point during the induction process you decide, you know what, I think I'd rather just have a C-section, you absolutely can ask for one. One thing that I would say is that you also have to be realistic about the practicalities of asking for a C-section, because if all the theatres are in use, and there is some people in front of you in the queue for a C-section who are higher risk, for example, or need an emergency C-section, then you could be waiting, or you may not get your C-section because by the time the theatre's ready, you've given birth, for example. So I think while we say, yes, you can change your mind and yes, you can ask for a C-section, you also have to prepare for the fact that it may not be as quick or as easy to get the C-section that you want. So you need to plan for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've kind of talked now about why you might be off induction. We've talked about weighing up the pros and cons, the methods of induction. So say now someone is listening and they've weighed up the pros and cons, they've made the decision, they're going to accept the induction because that's the right decision for them. How can they now put things in place to make sure it's still a positive experience for them?
So there's a few things that I think are really important. I think first is doing a really good birth plan. I know some people are really anti-birth preferences, but I actually think it's really important, particularly if you're going to have medical intervention. So make sure that you've considered the things that you do and don't want in your birth if you're having a hospital birth. I would also have a really good C-section plan in place so that if things do end up in a C-section, you've planned for it, you know what to ask for, so you have a positive experience of your C-section. I would also consider how you're going to adapt your induction cubicle. to make it more birth friendly, because induction wards are not set up to facilitate oxytocin. They are not set up to facilitate birth. They are set up for obstetric procedures. So thinking about moving the bed, and thinking about bringing fairy lights. I know everyone like laughs at hypnobirthing teachers because we say take fairy lights and candles and things, but actually it is really important because it completely changes the mood in the environment. And it does have a physiological impact on your hormonal production as well. Think about staying mobile, the fact that you don't have to just stay in the bed for 3 days. You can get up, you can walk up and down the ward. All that movement is going to help improve your chances of your induction working and labor progressing. Make sure you've packed for being in hospital for however many days, and that your birth partner has as well, because I think it's quite stressful if you go in and your birth partner hasn't prepared for being sat next to your bedside for 3 days, and they haven't got their toothbrush and they haven't got any of their stuff, and you don't want them to leave because you might go into labor at any point. Then you're left in limbo for days. So make sure your birth partner's prepared for that as well. I think those are probably the biggest things, I think, to make it a positive experience. And again, just making sure that you're really on board with the induction in the first place. Because if you think it is medically necessary, and yes, it is the right choice for you, then you focus on how to make that as positive as possible. You don't want to be looking back on it or in being in the thick of it and thinking this was the wrong idea. So making sure that you've asked all your questions that you may have, so that you feel like you have all the information that you need, and that you think, yes, okay, this is the right choice for me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Erin. This has been absolutely perfect. I really, really enjoyed this chat. I think we've covered just about everything. Can you think of anything else that someone should know if they're trying to weigh up their pros and cons?
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, like I mentioned, I do have an induction quick guide, and a lot of the stuff that I've talked about is in that quick guide, but it also has all the research and linked to all the evidence, which disputes, I'm going to say, quite a lot of the reasons for induction. So it does cover things like gestational diabetes, due dates, IVF, maternal age, ethnicity, and all those other common reasons. And it's got links to all of the research and different research studies. So that's quite handy, because sometimes if you're going into a discussion with the midwife or a consultant, and you're disputing the recommendation, it's handy to have that there. So you can say, well, actually, these are the stats. This is the percentage risk, because sometimes your care provider won't know, or they don't know off the top of their head.
Which is really scary, but true.
Yeah. But it's just policy, to them. Sometimes it's just policy. That's just what we do. So the guide's quite handy to have to hand, so that you can flick through it and you can actually reel off some stats and things. So I would recommend getting a copy of it, because I think most people will be having that induction discussion and will probably need some evidence and backing to discuss with their care provider. And just doing your prep is really, I think, is really, really important.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So before we sign off, you just want to talk about your services, and if someone wanted to work with you, how would they do that, and what do you offer?
So you can find me on pretty much every social media platform. My handle is the same on all of them. It's Better Birth UK. So I'm on X, or Twitter, as it was formerly known, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, and Threads. I've got a website, which is www.better-birth.co.uk as well. I teach antenatal classes and hypnobirthing. There's a few different options. So I do like an essentials course, which is 2 1.5-hour sessions, or there's a complete course, which is much more comprehensive, which is over 4 weeks, and that's 2 hours per session. I also do group sessions as well, which those are predominantly online. The other sessions, private sessions, I can do face-to-face or online, but the groups are online. And I have a pay what you can afford payment structure for that. So because I want to make sure that birth education is accessible for everybody, and not everyone can afford £400 for a course. So there's different price brackets, and you just pay whatever you can afford. And I will never ask for evidence or question how much you've paid. You can pay anywhere between £100 and £325 for the group course. And I also do various different guides which are available via Etsy. So like my induction quick guide. I have a home birth myth busting guide, which is quite handy if you're planning a home birth, or you're on the fence, or you've got a birth partner or family that needs convincing that that's the right option for you. And I also sell birth position cards as well. So understanding biomechanics and different birth positions for birth. And yeah, just drop me a message if you've got any questions. I'll always try and answer questions. I can't give medical advice, but I will always signpost to reliable sources of information and evidence. Yeah, go listen to the podcast as well, because there's lots of really good information on there too, which is the Better Birth podcast.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll put all of Erin's contact details in the show notes below, so you can just click through to her website and all her various places if you do want to get in touch. And so do you have one final thought or one final piece of advice before we sign off?
Don't go into birth blind. I say this all the time, but I think it's really, really important. Birth generally works, and we should be able to go into birth blind because it probably will just be all okay. But the reality is that most of us are birthing in a system that hinders physiological birth. And so I think it's really important that you prep. So whether that is doing some background reading or listening to podcasts like this or doing a course, whatever it is, just do something. Don't just wing it, because you might come out the other side and be lucky and be unscathed, but a lot of people are coming out traumatized, and it's because they went into birth blind.
Brilliant advice. Thank you so much, Erin, for joining us today.
Thank you.